In the autumn of 1889, a woman with dirt under her fingernails and a shotgun she'd never had to fire walked into the Bryan County Courthouse and paid $400 in silver for a piece of land that no one else in 3 counties would touch. The clerk counted the coins twice, certain there had been some mistake. There hadn't been. Rosalind Faircloth had just bought 128 acres of vine-strangled, half-wild bottomland that local men called the Green Grave, because nothing planted there ever lived long enough to be harvested, and because 2 previous owners had walked away from it swearing the land itself was cursed. Her neighbors said she'd lost her mind along with her husband. They said grief did strange things to a woman left alone at 34 with no children, no kin nearby, and a herd of goats too small to be called a proper operation. They said it over coffee at the Mercantile, and they said it louder after Sunday service, where the women of Bryan County liked to trade opinions the way men traded horses, loudly, and with a great deal of confidence in things they didn't understand. But 3 years later, that same worthless acreage would be the only orchard for 80 miles producing fruit in a drought that killed nearly everything else growing between the Brazos and the Colorado. And it would take a university-trained botanist, a skeptical old rancher who'd farmed that valley since before the war, and a herd of goats nobody respected to prove that Rosalind Faircloth hadn't lost her mind at all. She'd simply seen something the rest of them couldn't. This is her story. Before the goats, before the courthouse, before anyone in Bryan County had cause to whisper her name, Rosalind Faircloth had been the wife of a modestly successful cattleman named Walter Faircloth, and her life had followed the quiet, predictable rhythms of a ranch household with hired hands and a full pantry. She had married Walter at 23, a late marriage by the standards of the county, and she had come to it not from girlish infatuation but from a slow, sturdy affection that had grown between 2 practical people who understood each other's silences as well as their words. Walter had been a careful man, methodical in his bookkeeping and generous in his affections, and for 11 years the 2 of them had built something steady together on 400 acres of good grazing land north of the county seat. Their house had been modest but well kept, with a garden Rosalind tended herself and a porch where the 2 of them sat most evenings, watching the light fail over pastureland that had, in those years, never once given either of them cause for real worry. There had been no children, a fact that some in the county had whispered about with the particular cruelty small towns reserve for women whose private griefs are easiest to turn into gossip, but Rosalind and Walter had made a quiet peace with it between themselves, filling the space instead with animals, with neighbors, with the small rhythms of a working ranch that asked constant attention and gave back, in return, a kind of purpose neither of them ever spoke of needing but both of them clearly did. Then came the winter of 1886, the one old-timers still call the Big Die-Up, when a blizzard rolled down out of the Panhandle and killed cattle by the thousands across the whole of Texas. It had come with almost no warning, the temperature dropping nearly 60 degrees in the space of a single day, and ranchers across 4 counties lost entire herds in a matter of hours as cattle drifted before the wind and piled up dead against fence lines, unable to find shelter in a landscape that offered almost none. Walter rode out in the worst of it to bring in a herd trapped against a fence line, refusing to leave 24 head to freeze when he believed he could save them, and he never came back warm. He lingered 11 days with a fever in his lungs before he died, coughing blood into a handkerchief by the end, while Rosalind sat beside him through nights so cold the water in the basin froze solid by morning. She buried him in frozen ground with a borrowed pickaxe because the ground was too hard for a proper spade, and the neighbors who came to help dig said afterward they'd never seen a woman work a pickaxe with such grim, silent determination, never once asking to be spared the labor of burying her own husband. What the blizzard hadn't taken, the bank did. Walter's cattle loans had been larger than Rosalind knew, taken out the previous spring to expand the herd against a market that had looked promising and had instead collapsed along with half the cattle in the state. By the spring thaw she was a widow with 400 acres mortgaged to the eaves and a herd reduced to bones and hide, the survivors too weak and too few to service the debt that remained against them. She sold what she could, settled what debt she could, and was left, at the end of it, with $60, a wagon, 11 goats that had somehow survived the winter better than anything else on the place, and a silence in the house so complete it sometimes felt like another person living there with her. She was 31 years old and she had, by every measure the town understood, nothing left to build with. What nobody accounted for was that Rosalind had grown up not on a ranch but on her father's small dairy farm in the hill country, where goats had been the family's quiet, unglamorous salvation through 2 droughts and 1 bank panic. She knew things about goats that cattlemen never bothered to learn: how they cleared brush no cow would touch, how they thrived on land too poor and too tangled for anything else, how a small herd, tended with patience, could turn scrubland into pasture over the slow course of a few seasons. Her father had taught her, as a girl following him through pastures with a stick in her hand and burrs in her stockings, that goats were not lesser animals to be tolerated alongside cattle, but a different kind of tool altogether, one suited to problems cattle could never solve. She also knew, from a lifetime of watching her father work, that the emptiest, most despised piece of ground was often the cheapest, and that cheap ground given enough time was the only kind a person with $60 could ever hope to own outright. So when word passed through the county that the Belhaven tract, 128 acres along Coldwater Creek, so choked with wild kudzu vine and blackberry bramble that surveyors refused to walk it without a machete, was going up for a tax sale nobody wanted to bid on, Rosalind rode out alone to look at it. She stood at the edge of that green wall of vine, tall as a man's shoulders in places, swallowing fence posts and the bones of a barn that had once stood there, and she did not see a curse. She saw 11 goats and 3 years and a kind of freedom that had nothing to do with what the vine currently was, and everything to do with what patient, deliberate work could make it become. The land had passed through 2 previous owners in the space of a decade, a man who'd tried to burn the vine out and instead nearly lost his own farmhouse to the fire, and a family who'd given up after a single summer of futile clearing and moved on to Oklahoma without ever looking back. The county had all but stopped listing it for sale in the ordinary way, offering it instead at tax auction year after year to buyers who never came. It took her most of a year to save the $400, working as a seamstress in town and selling goat's milk and cheese door to door in a county that had never much cared for either, knocking on doors that were sometimes closed politely in her face by women who considered goat's cheese a strange and faintly disreputable thing for a widow to be peddling. She kept careful accounts in a small ledger she'd inherited from Walter, tracking every dollar earned and every dollar saved with the same discipline he'd once applied to his own books, and by the following autumn she had the sum in hand. When she finally walked into that courthouse and laid the silver on the counter, the clerk asked her, not unkindly, if she understood what she was buying. "I understand it better than you think," she said. "I've watched worse ground than that come back to life." The first winter on the Belhaven tract nearly broke her. She'd expected the vine to be stubborn. She had not expected the sheer, grinding scale of it, kudzu that had run unchecked for the better part of a decade, its roots gone deep and woody, its runners climbing every fence post and dead tree on the property until the whole 128 acres looked, from the ridge above, like a green ocean frozen midwave. She'd brought her 11 goats down in a borrowed cattle car and turned them loose at the edge of the vine, and she'd watched, that first evening, as they began doing the one thing goats do better than any other animal ever put on this earth, eating what nothing else would touch. It was not fast. It was not, that first winter, even visible progress to anyone who didn't know what to look for. She lived in a canvas tent and later a half-collapsed line shack she patched with scavenged lumber, its roof leaking in 3 places and its floor nothing but hard-packed dirt covered with what few boards she could scrounge, and she worked from before light until after dark clearing what the goats couldn't reach, cutting back the thickest of the old woody vine by hand with a hook-bladed knife, hauling brush to burn piles, and moving her small herd in careful rotations across sections of the property so the vine never had a chance to recover ground once it was cleared. The physical toll of that first winter was, in later years, something Rosalind rarely spoke of in detail, but those who knew her then remembered a woman whose hands had gone hard and calloused within weeks, whose face had weathered under sun and wind until she looked older than her 31 years, and whose meals, more often than not, consisted of whatever the goat's milk and a small garden plot could provide, supplemented by cornmeal and the occasional rabbit she managed to snare. She rose before dawn each morning to check the herd, spent the daylight hours in the brutal, repetitive labor of cutting vine and hauling brush, and fell into an exhausted sleep each night on a cot too short for her frame, in a shack that let the wind through its gaps no matter how she tried to seal them. Word got around the county fast, as it always does in small places. A widow woman living alone on cursed land, working herself half to death for goats. Men who rode past on the county road slowed their horses to look, and some of them laughed outright, and none of them stopped to help, because helping a woman who'd clearly made a foolish choice felt, to most of them, like encouraging the foolishness. The women of the county were, if anything, harsher in their judgment than the men, gathering after church to discuss what a shame it was, what a waste, and how surely the poor woman would come to her senses before winter's end and move back to town where she belonged. The closest thing she had to a neighbor was a rancher named Bartholomew Hollis, a broad, weathered man in his 60s with a face like cracked leather and a voice that carried across 2 pastures without effort, who ran cattle on the section adjoining hers and had farmed that valley since before the war. Hollis had watched 3 different owners fail on the Belhaven tract, and he did not think a widow with 11 goats was likely to be the exception. He rode over once, that first winter, mostly out of a grudging sense of neighborly obligation, and found her up to her elbows in cut vine, her hands wrapped in rags against the thorns, sweat freezing on her collar in the cold. "You know this ground killed 2 farmers before you," he said, not dismounting. "I heard," Rosalind said, not looking up from her work. "Land like this, it ain't worth the fighting. Best thing you could do is sell them goats and get back to town before winter finishes what the vine started." She straightened then, and looked at him with the kind of steady, unhurried patience that would come to define her in the years ahead. "Mr. Hollis, I didn't buy this land to fight it. I bought it to feed it to something that's hungrier than the vine is stubborn. Give it time." "Time's a luxury," Hollis said. "Money and stubbornness don't feed a person through winter." "No," she agreed. "But they do buy you the next spring." He rode off shaking his head, and told anyone who'd listen at the mercantile that the widow Faircloth had bought herself the most expensive weed patch in Briar County, and that she'd be selling out inside a year, same as the others. She did not sell out. Nearly 3 years passed on the Belhaven tract, 3 years of a rhythm that would have looked, to an outside eye, almost unbearably repetitive: move the goats, clear what they'd loosened, burn the brush piles, fence the cleared sections, breed the herd carefully to grow its numbers, and start the cycle again on the next stretch of vine. She lost goats to coyotes and to a hard freeze her second winter that she hadn't been prepared for, waking one January morning to find 3 of her best breeding does dead in the pen, frozen where they stood, and grieving each loss with a quiet intensity that surprised even her, given how practical she otherwise tried to be about the business of farming. She lost a portion of one summer's clearing to a wildfire that jumped from a neighbor's burn pile and took nearly 4 acres of freshly cut brush with it, watching helplessly from the ridge as months of careful work went up in a single afternoon of smoke and flame, and having to begin that section over from nothing the following spring. She went, more than once, to bed hungry so the goats could eat, because a starving herd meant nothing at all got cleared, and a hungry widow at least had the strength to keep working, even if that strength grew thinner with each passing month of the leanest years. There were nights, alone in that patched-together line shack with the wind coming hard off the creek, when she allowed herself to wonder whether Hollis had been right, whether she'd sunk everything she had left into a piece of ground that would simply never give it back. She kept, in those low moments, a small photograph of Walter on the shelf above her cot, taken not long after their wedding, his expression stiff and formal in the way of those old photographs, but his eyes, she always thought, still carrying some trace of the warmth she remembered, and she would sometimes speak to it the way a person speaks to someone who can no longer answer. "I know it looks like nothing," she said to it once, on a night when the goats had gotten into a section of poison ivy mixed in with the kudzu and half the herd was sick for a week, their faces swollen and their appetites gone, leaving her to nurse them through the worst of it with cool compresses and whatever remedies she could improvise. "But it isn't nothing to me. It's the first thing since you died that's mine to finish." That, in the end, was the deeper truth underneath the labor. Rosalind hadn't taken on the Belhaven tract because she believed it would make her wealthy. She'd taken it on because after a year of being handled gently by well-meaning neighbors, a year of being spoken of in the past tense as though her life had ended alongside her husband's, she needed something enormous and difficult and entirely her own to prove, to the county, and mostly to herself, that she was still a person capable of building rather than only surviving. There was, in the slow grinding work of clearing that vine, a kind of honesty she had found nowhere else in the 2 years since Walter's death, no one offering pity she hadn't asked for, no one suggesting she remarry for practicality's sake, no one treating her as a problem to be solved. There was only the land, and the goats, and the work, and the simple, uncomplicated fact that each acre cleared was an acre she had cleared herself, with no one's help and no one's permission. By the spring of the 3rd year, the vine was gone from nearly 90 of the 128 acres. What had been an impassable green wall was now open, rolling pasture, the old woody kudzu roots dead and dry in the ground, replaced by native grass the goats had helped reseed simply by moving through it, dropping and treading seed into the loosened soil. The line shack had become a proper small house, built board by board with lumber she'd bought with money from her growing goat herd, its walls sound and its roof tight against the weather at last. The 11 original goats had become nearly 90, a herd substantial enough now that she'd had to hire on a boy from town 2 days a week simply to help with the milking and the fence work, though she still did the bulk of the labor herself, unwilling to trust the finer points of the operation to hired hands who hadn't lived through the years of learning what worked and what didn't on this particular ground. And Bartholomew Hollis, riding the fence line between his section and hers one morning in early April, stopped his horse at the top of the ridge and sat there a long while, looking down at open pasture where he remembered nothing but vine. He did not say anything to her that day. But he stopped telling people at the mercantile that she'd be selling out, and in the months that followed, his visits to the Belhaven tract grew more frequent, though he never quite admitted, even to himself, that what had begun as skepticism had slowly, grudgingly, turned into something closer to respect. The turning point, the one that would, in time, change the shape of everything, came from a direction Rosalind hadn't expected at all. A rancher 3 sections over, a careful, results-only sort of man named Nathaniel Ward, had heard through the same gossip channels that had once mocked her that the widow Faircloth's goats had cleared nearly 100 acres of the worst brush country in the region in under 3 years, at a cost of almost nothing but her own labor and patience. Ward was not a man given to sentiment or to taking chances on unproven methods, having built his own modest ranching operation through decades of careful, unglamorous discipline, but he was a man who recognized value when the numbers made sense, and the numbers, as he understood them, made a great deal of sense. Ward had a 40-acre section overrun with cedar and mesquite scrub that he'd been paying men to clear by hand for 2 summers running, at a cost that was eating steadily into his profits, with slow and unsatisfying results, the men he hired doing only as much work as they were watched to do, and the scrub growing back nearly as fast as they cleared it. He rode out to the Belhaven tract not to offer sympathy or advice, but to ask a plain, practical question. "I hear your goats cleared this whole spread," he said, standing at her fence line with his hat in his hands, looking out over the open pasture behind her, pasture that stretched further than he'd been led to believe by the second-hand accounts he'd heard in town. "They did," Rosalind said. "With my help. I've got 40 acres of cedar and mesquite choking out my good grazing. I've paid men 2 summers to clear it and I've got precious little to show for the money spent. Would you consider hiring your herd out?" It was not a question anyone had asked her before, and for a moment she simply looked at him, working through the practical shape of it. She had never thought of her goats as a service to be sold, only as a tool for her own land. But the logic of it was immediate and obvious once spoken aloud. "I'd have to move a portion of the herd onto your land, fence it in sections, and rotate them same as I do here," she said. "It's not fast work. It won't look like much for months." "I don't need fast," Ward said. "I need it to actually work, and I need it to cost less than what I'm paying now." "Then I'll do it," Rosalind said. "But I'll want payment monthly, and I'll want it in writing what we've agreed, so there's no confusion later about what the goats can and can't manage." Ward extended his hand, and she shook it, and that plain, unglamorous handshake became the first paying contract of what would eventually be called, across 4 counties, the Faircloth Land Clearing Herd, a business that grew, over the following 2 years, into steady, dependable income that funded improvements on the Belhaven tract far faster than her own labor alone could have managed. Other ranchers followed Ward's lead once they saw his cedar breaks turn to grass in under a year at a fraction of the cost of hired clearing crews, word of the arrangement spreading the way practical solutions always do among practical people, faster and with far less resistance than the original gossip about her had ever traveled. By the 2nd year of the arrangement, Rosalind had grown her herd past 200 head and hired 2 young men from town to help manage the rotations on client land while she focused her own attention back on the Belhaven tract itself, training the young men carefully in the methods she developed through years of trial and hard-won experience, insisting on the same patient, deliberate rotation schedule on client land that she used on her own, refusing to rush the work even when clients grew impatient for faster results. It was during that 2nd year, walking a newly cleared section of her own land near Coldwater Creek, that she found the thing that would change everything again. She'd noticed it first as a strange, stubborn cluster of old trees near the creek bank, gnarled and half-wild, their bark rough and their limbs twisted in ways that suggested great age and long neglect, but which had somehow survived buried under kudzu for years without dying outright. When she cleared the last of the vine away from around their bases that spring, working carefully with the hook-bladed knife she still preferred over any newer tool, she found something she hadn't expected at all. They were fruit trees. Old apple and pear trees, planted by some settler decades before, long since abandoned and swallowed by the vine, but alive, gnarled, unpruned, half-starved for light, but alive, and beginning, now that they had sun and room again, to put out blossoms for what might have been the first time in a decade. She counted nearly 40 trees scattered across for acres near the creek, a hidden orchard that had simply been waiting, buried and forgotten, for someone to clear away what was choking it. Rosalind did not know enough about old fruit trees to know whether they could truly be saved, or whether they'd been too long neglected to ever bear reliable fruit again. So she wrote a letter to the State Agricultural Extension Office in Austin, describing what she'd found and asking whether anyone there might be able to advise her, and some months later, in the early autumn of the 4th year, a young botanist named Emmett Sorrell arrived by train and then by hired horse, carrying a satchel of instruments and a notebook already half filled with observations from other counties, his manner precise and quietly formal in a way that struck Rosalind, at first meeting, as almost out of place against the rough practicality of her land. Sorrell was a slight, precise man in his early 30s, with wire spectacles and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had learned, the hard way, not to make promises he couldn't keep. He walked Rosalind's newly discovered orchard for the better part of 2 days, examining bark and root and blossom with a patience that matched her own, taking measurements and notes with a thoroughness that impressed her even before he'd offered a single opinion, before he sat down with her on the porch of the little house she'd built and told her what he'd found. "These are old varieties," he said. "Some I don't recognize at all, which likely means whoever planted them brought grafts or seed stock from somewhere back east, maybe even from Europe. Varieties that aren't grown commercially anymore. That makes them valuable in a way most people wouldn't guess, not just for the fruit, but for the stock itself. Nurseries pay well for scion-wood from old, hardy varieties nobody else has anymore. And can they be saved?" Rosalind asked. "Truly saved, not just kept alive." Sorrell was quiet a moment, and then he told her, plainly, about his own family's small orchard in East Texas, lost 20 years before to a late frost his father had refused to prepare for out of stubborn pride, insisting the old trees would weather it as they always had. They hadn't. The whole orchard had died in a single week, and Sorrell had watched his father age 10 years in that same span, grieving trees the way other men grieved people, a grief that had, in its own quiet way, shaped the whole of Sorrell's careful, methodical approach to his profession ever since. "I don't make promises about trees anymore," Sorrell said. "I've seen what happens when people do. But I'll tell you what I can tell you honestly. These trees are stronger than they have any right to be, given what they survived. With careful pruning, proper feeding of the soil, and patient work over several seasons, I believe you could have a productive orchard here inside for 4 or 5 years. Not fast. Not certain. But possible, if you're willing to do it the slow, correct way instead of pushing for quick results. I don't know any other way to do things," Rosalind said. "Slow is the only method that's ever worked for me." Sorrell smiled at that, the first real smile she'd seen from him in 2 days of careful, measured conversation. "Then you're exactly the kind of person these trees needed to find." The work of restoring the orchard was, in its way, harder than clearing the vine had been, because it demanded a different kind of patience, not the brute, grinding labor of cutting and burning, but the slow, exacting discipline of pruning correctly, feeding soil that had been starved for a decade, and waiting through entire growing seasons to see whether the previous season's work had taken hold at all. Sorrell corresponded with her regularly by letter over the following 2 years, advising her through each season's tasks in careful, patient detail, correcting her missteps gently when she made them, and traveling out from Austin twice more to walk the orchard rows himself and confirm that the trees were responding as he'd hoped. Rosalind brought in a specialized partner to help her manage the process at scale, a nursery owner from the next county over named Dorian Voss, a man who had spent 30 years working with old and heirloom fruit varieties and who arrived at the Belhaven tract expecting, based on what he'd heard, to find an overeager widow rushing toward disappointment. a common enough pattern among the amateur orchardists he'd encountered over the course of his long career. What he found instead was a woman who had already, on Sorrel's advice, spent an entire season doing nothing but careful, minimal pruning and soil restoration, refusing to push the trees toward fruit production before they were strong enough to bear it. Most folks I deal with want results the first season, Voss told her, walking the orchard rows with his hands clasped behind his back, examining her pruning cuts with an expert's careful eye, nodding approvingly at cuts made cleanly and at angles that showed she'd absorbed Sorrel's instruction thoroughly. They plant, they push, and they lose half their stock to exhaustion inside 3 years. You're doing this the deliberate way. The way that actually works, long term. I've learned the hard way that pushing land past what it's ready for just breaks it faster, Rosalind said. I'd rather have this orchard bearing fruit reliably in 10 years than have it half dead in 3 because I got greedy for a quick harvest. Voss nodded slowly, and something in his manner shifted from cautious professional courtesy toward genuine respect. That's not slowness, Mrs. Faircloth. That's strategy. There's a difference, and most people never learn it. He became, over the following seasons, both a business partner and a steady advisor, supplying grafting stock from her old varieties to nurseries across the state, and helping her expand the orchard's productive acreage gradually, always favoring soundness over speed, teaching her the finer points of grafting technique on visits that stretched, sometimes, into full weeks as he walked her through each stage of the process with the patient thoroughness of a man who genuinely enjoyed passing on hard-earned knowledge. The income from grafting stock alone, sold to nurseries eager for hardy old varieties suited to Texas heat and drought, soon rivaled the income from her goat-clearing business, and together the two ventures gave Rosalind something she had not had since Walter's death, genuine financial security, built entirely on her own labor and judgment. She expanded the orchard slowly and carefully over the years that followed, always guided by Sorrel's early counsel to favor soundness over speed, adding new rows only when the existing trees had proven themselves strong and productive, and refusing every offer from eager investors who wanted to fund a faster, larger expansion in exchange for a share of the eventual profits. She had learned, by then, that the slow way was the only way she trusted, and she had the growing orchard and the steady, reliable income to prove that trust had not been misplaced. More than 2 decades later, in the spring of 1911, a young newspaper reporter named Sarah traveled out from Austin to the Belhaven tract to write a feature story on what had, by then, become one of the most celebrated small agricultural operations in the region, 128 acres that had once been condemned as worthless, now home to a thriving orchard of nearly 600 trees, a goat-clearing business still operating across 4 counties, and a woman in her late 50s who was, by any measure, one of the more quietly respected landowners in the whole valley. Rosalind walked her through the orchard on a clear April morning, the trees heavy with blossom, the old creek running full and easy alongside rows that had once been buried under a decade of choking vine. Bartholomew Hollis, well into his 80s by then and long retired from active ranching, had taken to sitting some mornings on Rosalind's porch, a habit that had begun sometime in that 3rd or 4th year and never quite stopped, the two of them having settled, over the decades, into an easy, comfortable friendship that neither of them had ever quite expected from those first hostile exchanges at the fence line. Mrs. Faircloth, the reporter asked, notebook in hand, when you look back on all of this, the vine, the years of clearing, the trees nobody expected to survive, what would you say was the actual turning point? The moment you knew this was going to work? Rosalind considered the question for a long moment, looking out over rows of blossoming trees that had, decades before, been nothing but a rumor of green buried under kudzu. Everyone wants to believe there was one moment, she said. A discovery, a lucky break, something dramatic. And I understand why, it makes for a better story. But the truth is, the turning point wasn't finding the trees, and it wasn't Mr. Ward hiring my goats, and it wasn't even the day Professor Sorrel told me the orchard could be saved. Those were all important. But the real turning point happened years before any of that, on a cold night in my first winter here, when I was alone in a half-collapsed shack with 11 goats and no earthly reason to believe I'd made a good decision. I decided, that night, that I wasn't working this land to prove anyone wrong. I was working it because it was mine to finish, and because finishing something difficult and entirely my own was the only thing that made sense to me after I'd lost everything else. Everything that came after, the goats, the trees, the money, all of it, that was just what happened when I refused to stop." The reporter was quiet a moment, pen resting on her notebook. "That's a remarkable thing to have decided, alone, on a night like that." "It didn't feel remarkable," Rosalind said. "It felt like the only choice I had left that I could still make for myself. Sometimes that's all a person needs. Not a guarantee of success. Just one choice that's still theirs to make." If you take one thing away from Rosalind Faircloth's story, let it be this: the land nobody else wants is very often not cursed at all. It's simply waiting for someone willing to work it slowly, honestly, and without needing to be believed by anyone else first. You do not need the whole county's approval to begin something difficult. You do not need certainty that it will work before you're willing to try. What you need is the same thing Rosalind carried into that first cold winter with nothing but 11 goats and a piece of ground everyone else had given up on: a willingness to keep showing up, season after season, long after it stops looking like progress to anyone watching from the road. Whatever your own 128 acres looks like, whatever the thing is in your life that other people have called foolish, or impossible, or simply not worth the trouble, know that patience and quiet, disciplined labor have a way of proving the skeptics wrong far more often than anyone expects. The vine does not win. Given enough time, and enough willingness to keep clearing one section at a time, it never does. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you the longest. Leave a comment down below and let me know. And if you enjoyed traveling back to Bryan County with Rosalind today, please consider giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that slow, honest work still counts for something, and subscribing for more stories like hers. Until next time, may you find the patience to keep clearing your own 128 acres, one season at a time. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.